I recently had a chance to sit down with Senator Sam Zurier of Providence to discuss his legislative commission on alternative voting choices. Here is that full interview.
So you had your own primary, so you had firsthand knowledge.
That's right. I was in a five-way primary when I was first elected. I received 31%, which gave me the nomination. But that meant more than two-thirds of the voters wanted somebody else. The people who finished second and third shared 47% between them. They thought they were more closely aligned to the issues than me. So each of them were pointing the finger at the other and saying, if you hadn't run, I could have beaten that guy with the 31%. So that's how I was introduced to this issue personally.
And so the legislative commission came about. Did you approach leadership? Did they talk to you? How did that go?
I asked, when I entered the General Assembly, I introduced a ranked choice bill and also a study commission. And it was clear that there'd be a lot of work needed before we could pass any legislation. But thankfully, leadership agreed to a study commission.
So the four things you studied: ranked choice, top two, runoff, and then appeals, approval voting.
Yes.
So we'll get to that in a second. So you talked to a lot of people, and there was that group that came in, Guy Dufault and Gary Sass's group. What do they call it? The
People's primary.
Yeah. So what did you even know that they existed, or what was the interaction between the committee and them?
When they heard about this commission, they contacted me and said that they were interested in the issue and they would like to present. And they came and they gave an excellent presentation.
Tell me about the commission's work. How much work went into getting to this 30-page document?
We held, I think, 5 or 6 hearings, and we had presentations from a number of experts and interest groups. And then legal counsel for the Senate did an enormous amount of research on top of that, put up with some kibitzing from the senator, and produced, I think, an excellent first draft. With that said, there's a lot more work to do because the commissioners themselves did not see it before this draft was ready. We had a meeting on Monday. They offered their feedback, and that will be incorporated into the final draft of the report.
And I'm sorry I wasn't there on Monday. What did you hear? What stood out to you when the commissioners were having their dialogue back and forth?
The commissioners clearly had spent some time reading the report and understanding the issues. And for the most part, they were talking about which of the alternatives made the most sense to them. My fellow elected officials were talking about largely policy issues. The others were election officials talking about how to implement it and administration. And they were talking about which systems would be easiest to administer.
So you look to other states, and again, there's no definitive word on this. There were pros and cons to each, but let's go through at least a couple of these. The ranked choice voting, I think the thing that stuck out to me, some states are doing it, but you remember in New York City when Mayor Adams was ranked, to me, the biggest barrier on ranked choice voting is sometimes it can take a long time and people get impatient. Is that your thought too, or?
Well, that's certainly a concern. It is more complicated. Instead of having a single line in which the voter chooses all the candidates, instead the voter has a grid, and you have to rank the candidates. So that increases the length of the ballot. It increases the complexity for the voter, the complexity for election administrators. And as far as general elections go, there's also a problem or a potential issue with our Constitution, which says that for state elections, you have to select the plurality winner. So if you were talking about state elections in November, we would have to change the Constitution in order to implement ranked choice voting for that. We could do it probably for primaries or for federal elections without changing the Constitution. But for the November election, state offices, right now our Constitution says plurality.
But I would think from a practical standpoint, you probably want to have everything the same so people don't get confused. You're either going to go all in or you're not going to do it.
I think you're right. I mean, I think that we have to be careful when we change our right to vote. It's the most important part of our democratic institutions, and you don't want to confuse voters. You want to have a lot of education. States that have implemented ranked choice have had a lead time of 2 years or 4 years before doing that. Now, could we have a system where some elections are decided one way and others another? Yes, in theory, if you had sufficient education. but you would want to be very, very careful before doing that.
At the end of your report in the recommendations, right off the top, you said, we want to try to increase voter turnout, particularly in the primaries. You're very protective of that, aren't you? Or you want to boost that. You don't want to do anything to inhibit that.
That is true. That was something that all the commissioners, the findings that we presented were before the commissioners spoke, but that was something that a lot of the commissioners spoke about. So yes, the primaries are a problem because right now, um, in districts which are heavily weighted towards one party or the other, the primary essentially decides who's going to be elected. And we have that. We had that recently with our congressional race in my district. So yes, there is a concern when you have a very low turnout, and the people in that who vote in that primary are in essence deciding who will be elected in November.
Also, with ranked choice, before we go on to top two, with ranked choice, there's also, and I saw this in your report, there's also cost. There's a because you have to maybe with poll workers and making sure that you are up to speed in infrastructure, maybe for lack of a better word, right? Because it could play out over a little bit of time.
That is true. However, we had a presentation from the Fair Vote people and from Maine, in which they talked about states and jurisdictions that have adopted ranked choice, and they say that it's worth the cost.
Okay. Top two. What about top two?
So the main state that uses that is California, and they've had it since 2011 or 2012, I forget which. And the way that one works is that you have a primary in which everybody enters. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat, Republican, Independent, everybody enters. You can share your affiliation, but out of that, you take the top two who finish, and they're on the November ballot, nobody else.
What about Rhode? I think you would get some pushback probably from the Republicans in Rhode Island on that, would you not?
Yes, and we noted that in our report. In a certain number of cases in California, the top two in that nonpartisan primary are Democrats, and you have one Democrat against another. And the proponents of top two say this can be a good thing because sometimes you have in a primary you have a fragmented electorate and extreme candidates who win the primary. And by having, if a Democrat is going to win anyway, giving the voters choice between two Democrats might increase the chances you won't have an extreme candidate who commands a narrow lane of the total voters.
What are some of the challenges? We talked about ranked choice, but what are some of the challenges with top two in your mind to get from here to there if we were going to go that way?
Well, again, there may be a constitutional issue. Can you limit access to the November ballot to the people who are the top two in the primary? That's one issue. It happens that there are versions of top two that are in certain municipal elections, including Cranston and Coventry. And on our commission panel, we had a senator from Coventry and an election official from Cranston, and they both were very comfortable with how it's administered. They say it can work. The challenge would be getting more people to come to the primary to participate. One of the rules of top two is even if somebody wins a majority in the primary, you still have to have a November election between the top two. And that's one way to prevent a small number of people from deciding the outcome.
The next one, runoff.
Yes.
And so tell me about how that would work.
So runoff, you see that in southern states. It has an unfortunate history going back to post-Civil War, where certain states wanted to make sure that the candidate who won was a white candidate and not a candidate of color. But the way it works is that if there is either a primary or an election in which no candidate gains a majority, you take the top two from that primary or that election, they run off against each other in a second election. We saw that in Georgia in the United States Senate races that took place in 2020.
Any constitutional issues with runoff?
Potentially. Now, there are a couple other issues with runoff. There's obviously expense because you could have 4 elections instead of 2. Another issue is what's called voter fatigue. Somebody votes in November, and then they're told, "Oh, you have to come back in December or January and vote again," and that can result in reduced turnout at the second election. And so again, it doesn't have the best picture of the will of the majority.
Approval voting. I'd never heard of this before. What is approval voting?
Approval voting is something that hasn't been adopted widely, but the idea is that you have several candidates on the ballot, and the voter can say, "I like as many of them as the voter wishes." If there are 5 candidates, the voter might say, "I want to give votes to 3 out of the 5." And that's another way to deal with this issue of when you have a large ballot of candidates, you're worried about whether a fringe candidate is going to command a plurality of 30% or 20% without reflecting the views of the other folks.
But in your report, you said you might bump up against one vote, one person.
Yes, there's a constitutional issue there. And that also would take some voter education. And, I actually looked at a version of approval voting many years ago when I was in college. And you could imagine in the presidential preference primary, in an early primary, you could say there's 6 candidates, and you're not necessarily trying to winnow it out to 2 at that point or 1. You're just trying to get the field slightly smaller, and there it might work. When you have an election at the end, it gets more confusing. There may be strategic voting involved. I only like this person, so I'm not going to vote for the other ones. So it gets more complicated with a one-shot primary and one-shot election.
It seems that the theme through a lot of this is if you were to go to any of those 4, there's a lot of education and a learning curve for the voters, are there not?
Absolutely. And I might add, just as an aside, there are hybrids, combinations of these things. One of them is in Alaska. So what Alaska does is called Final Four. You have a nonpartisan primary. The top 4 candidates end up on the November ballot and ranked choice, the November ballot for those 4. And that adds another layer of complexity. With that said, that system, I actually think if voters could understand it, it might combine some of the best features of these.
Therein lies the issue, if voters could understand it, because there's a nuance and a complexity to it, isn't there?
Absolutely. I mean, and again, my own version of that would be top 3. And the reason for that for me is that I hate 3-way elections. We have had a number of them. I live in Providence. I had a mayor, Buddy Cianci, who always succeeded in 3-way elections. And
With
I think
40% of the vote.
Exactly. And it never reflected the will of the majority. And, as a voter, I would be personally willing to learn a new system to help deal with the 3-candidate problem. And it's not limited to Providence's mayoral election. We've had elections for governor, both at the primary and in the election with these 3-way elections. And I find that to be a real frustration in terms of rule by the majority.
Well, I think part of the impetus too, in 2010, it was Link Chafee, Ken Block, John Robitaille, and Frank Caprio.
Yes.
All made it to the end because 2 were Link Chafee and Ken Block were independent, so they made it to the ballot.
Sure.
And then you had Gina Raimondo's first election where she got less than 50% of the vote. So I think basically there's a sense of fairness that people say, why should that person, I think it's a good question to ask, should that person be able to win with significantly less than 50% of the vote?
Yeah.
And that's really what it comes down to, right?
Exactly. When we think about democracy in grade school, we're often taught majority rules. So what happens when a candidate doesn't command a majority? And I'll offer another example we cite in the report. The Democratic primary for governor in 2002. Now that one was Senator Whitehouse, Sheldon Whitehouse, Tony Pyries and Murph York.
Mhm.
And after that election, primary rather, the two losing candidates pointed the finger at each other and said, if you hadn't run, I could have won the primary. And those two,
Much like your election, right?
yes, and they thought that they were more closely aligned on the issues, and that either one of them would have better reflected the majority than did the successful candidate. So we have a lot of these three-way races. Arguably, if you limited ranked choice to 3, it would be less complicated than ranked choice for 5 or 8 or something like that.
So where does this go from here? I know it's the first draft. How do you see something being ready for the next legislative session? Is that your goal, or do you think it's going to take longer than that?
My hope is, first of all, to introduce legislation to repeal the section of the Constitution that limits us to plurality voting in statewide general elections. That definitely is going in. My hope is that this report also supports legislation for various alternatives. So, for example, one of the easiest elections in which you could have ranked choice voting would be the presidential preference primary. Now, we can't do that for the one next year. But 4 years from now, what makes that one easiest to do is that you only have one choice on the ballot. So you don't have a grid, you don't have 6 grids. And you also have 5 or 6 candidates who are going to be teaching voters about how it works. And they could say, for example, candidate A could say, I want you to vote for me, but I don't have a problem if you take B as your second choice. And B could flip it around. You saw a little bit of that in New York in the mayoral election of 2021. There were administration problems there.
So maybe use that as the dry run or the test run to see how it works?
Exactly. That might be another alternative. That's something that Senator Raptakis suggested when we met on Monday.
At some point, somebody has to say, we're going to put forward ranked choice, or we're going to put forward top 2, or we're going to put forward runoff. I mean, that's eventually, it takes more study, which you said in your report, but at some point, don't you have to present it as one option you think to go forward?
Well, what we learned from our hearings was that there's a group called Project Fair Vote. They like ranked choice. There's another group called People's Primary. They like top 2. And my hope is that they make good presentations to the General Assembly in the coming session. I'm hoping we'll have legislation of both kinds, and that our report will help people understand what's involved with these issues. I would be surprised if we passed any specific plan this year, because there's some legal issues and so on. And we're talking about the right to vote. It's a very serious thing. You want to be very careful before you change what we have. But with that said, my hope is that we do find something that's better than what we have currently, because with the three-way races, with the multi-candidate races where you have a fringe candidate who gets elected, this is not the way we were taught democracy works when we were in grade school and high school. So it may take a little time, but my hope would be, and I would like to work towards an improvement over what we have.
Just one last question, unless you have anything to add. So the timetable would be you have a general election to get, at the very least, to potentially change the Constitution. I should know this, but is that a vote that would provide that? Do you have to go through a constitutional convention, or do you put something on the ballot to say, we want to change the Constitution to do this? Is that as simple as doing that in a general election, or do you have to do some other additional process?
If the General Assembly wanted to, they could put that issue on the November ballot for next year.